Well, thanks very much. This is me, obviously. What we saw this morning was a lot of birds out on the bay, but actually most of those that we saw don't spend the whole year around here. So a lot will just disappear off at other places. Some of them will go up to the upper reaches of the Findhorn, onto the moors up there. Others will go much further afield. So what I want to do is just give you a quick taster of some of the birds that we saw and some that we didn't actually see, but they were out there, as to the sort of numbers we have on the bay, when they come, and it's a very important overwintering ground for a lot of species, and certainly the biggest area in Moray and Nairn really for birds. But it is quite difficult to see, so I'll bring you in a bit closer to some of the birds that we get then. Swans, we didn't actually see any this morning. I did yesterday see a number of whooper swans. They come through at this time of year. They use the bay, like the geese, as a place to roost overnight, and then they'll disappear off onto fields, stubble fields, grass fields. There are quite a lot, or there have been until quite recently, down around Duffers Castle, back of Lossiemouth and around there. And if you're down that way, you'll see quite a lot of whooper swans in the fields. The mute swans are actually resident most of the year round here. So this is just an idea, and I'll show you this graph on a number of species. So basically, this is for the whooper swans, where they come from. Most probably come from Iceland, but they also breed all the way across the northern region. So some will come here. Usually down this end of the bay, but you'll sometimes see them in the channels in the north. The graph along the bottom, you don't need to pay too much attention to, but the whoopers in green here just really arrive at this time of year. We do sometimes see them again in at the end of spring, and a few over winter, but they're basically transitional. Whereas the geese, the mute swans stay here most of the year round, but there are periods, like at the moment actually, where there aren't any at all. But typically we would see 15 to 20 around the bay at this time of year. But you go to other places, inshore locks and so on, you'll see them on the locks there. So that's the swans then. Onto the geese, and this is obviously what we were looking at basically this morning. Virtually all pinkfoot geese. Yesterday I did see one or two others, and for the sharper amongst you, you can see one down here. That's a barnacle goose. And there's another one up just up there. That's a barnacle goose as well. So you do get one or two barnacle geese in with them. And as you saw this morning, they disappear off onto the fields, and this is actually in springtime at the south end of the bay. And you can see that they're quite dark-headed, and you probably noticed that whilst you were out on the bay today. And the bills are largely black, but have a little bit of pink on them. And legs obviously are pink as well. The other goose which we get, I'll talk quickly about their migrations, and mainly from Iceland, but some from Greenland as well. There are populations further over, but they tend to avoid us and go further south. And the geese can really be anywhere on the bay. In fact, they were all around here initially, but they then moved down there. You see them arrive in sort of September time period, and their numbers rapidly rise up. These figures, incidentally, for 2022 that I took on the bay. So you're talking a maximum over 40,000 in sort of early November. Numbers then sort of dropped off a bit before they overwintering with about anything between 5,000 and 10,000, and then another bit of a peak in March when they come back through. Before migrating back to where they came from for the summer breeding. The other goose, which is also around, not in such big numbers at the moment, there probably might have been a few right over the far side of the bay this morning, are the grey-lag geese. And they're distinguished, look quite similar in many ways at a distance, but bright orange beaks, and their heads are less dark, slightly bigger geese as well. So if we were to see them both side by side, this is slightly bigger. These have rather a different sort of migration pattern. So what we do is quite a lot of resident grey-lag geese, which come from maybe the upper reaches of the Findhorn, up on Darvermore, around Lochindorb inland. And if you're up there in the summer, you'll see lots grazing on the fields beside Lochindorb and in other places. That lot will come down to us in sort of late August or even early August once they've finished breeding, and we see good numbers on the bay. Numbers then drop off, and then eventually around this time period in mid-November, we often see another group coming in, and they're usually the Iceland ones, and maybe a few from Scandinavia as well. And but they're often down sort of in this corner of the bay, down the southwest corner. A few other of the birds out in the bay, you might have seen mallard. They're very common resident there, but they gather down on the bay in the winter. There's probably 150 or so out on the bay, just dabbling ducks, so feeding on whatever they find out on the bay, the grasses and so on. The male on the right and the female, as is typical with a lot of ducks, on the left, a fairly brown coloured bird. Widgeon, there were some, which I pointed out to one or two people, I think, right down in the Kinloss corner this morning. They come in, they're not resident in this country, or very few are, and they're migratory. And again, mostly come in from Iceland, and their numbers suddenly shoot up in early September, up to a high of usually several thousand. But the numbers by now have dropped back down to about 700 or 800, and they'll stay in that sort of number until they eventually disperse, go back to Iceland. And a few do breed inland, but not a great number. Most of these that we have are migratory. But again, they will go back into the upper reaches, possibly of the Findhorn, any lochs up in there. So some of these birds do have an association, not just with the bay, but with the upper reaches as well of the Findhorn. Teal, we didn't see any this morning. There are about 100 or so on the bay at the moment, but they do breed in the UK, but we also get residents coming in. But they're down in these channels here. So if you're around the south of the bay on this road that goes around the south, this is the Mosset. You'll see quite a few in that channel there. Pintail, now we did see these, and these are actually a real success story on the bay. 25, 30 years ago, you probably saw no more than 10 or so. There are now, yesterday I had 510 counted on the bay, so really big numbers, and they've just steadily increased over the years. And yet, nationally, this is a species that have declined in numbers quite considerably. So Findhorn Bay has really bucked the trend. And although you do get one or two elsewhere, the vast majority in the local area are actually out on the bay overwintering. And in really good numbers now as well. So these are the ones that you were looking at through the scope, for those of you who saw them. The males with the white on the head, and the females, again, fairly distinguished because of their long necks and their sort of longish tails, particularly in the males, which have, as the name suggests for the bird, these long pintails. Again, these are pretty much all migratory. So none over the summer months at all, so they're just in the winter months. And as I say, up to sort of 700 last year in late November, so we may still get yet more. And they're really all the way down this channel, come in from a variety of places across Northern Europe, where a lot of these places, they breed in, are too cold in winter because of the snow and ice. So that's why a lot of birds will move, because they simply can't feed. So they come into the warmer climates of Western Europe and further south. So this is the driving force between a lot of these migrations.
What's the dip? There's quite often there seems to be a dip just right in the middle of winter there.
Yeah. Their numbers do fluctuate a bit, and actually, to be honest, it may just be these were just the figures I got, and it could well be that I was counting from the bird-hide area, and there were some right over in, let's say, if they're over in channels over here, I may just simply have missed it because it's 2 kilometres across the bay, and it just sometimes, like this morning, there was a bit of a haze in the air, and it's just really difficult to see. So yeah, it is slightly difficult to count.
Not that they're heading somewhere else.
No, not really. A few might move along into the sort of the Coolburn Bar areas. But the vast majority are in this area. But there are others across in Cromarty Firth and so on as well. So there are. This is not the only population, but it's certainly the biggest population in the local area at the moment. Goldeneye we didn't spot this morning, but I put it in just in case we did. There are about 20 or so up in the northern end of the bay. These are diving ducks actually, so they dive down for sort of crustaceans and small fish or whatever. The males have this distinguished white patch and a greenish sheen on their head. The females, brown heads, but they're quite sort of rounded heads, and they're often in groups. You might see them off here if you went over to the War Memorial and looked out in the channels there. You may see them, and they keep on diving, but they're often in groups. So quite a few of them around on the bay. A few do breed inland, so I'm not aware of the upper reaches of the Findhorn, but certainly in the Spey Valley, Newton Moor and places like that, where you've got sort of lochs with reeds around the side, there are small numbers breeding, but the vast majority of these come from abroad, particularly Scandinavia, and possibly even further afield, Russia and so on. Again, this is quite a late arrival, so actually they've only just started to build up, and at the moment we're only at about sort of that sort of level. So, you know, we might see 60 or 70. Some of the lochans around here have got them on as well, so they do get onto freshwater lochs as well. Shoulder, we were talking about out in the bay, we saw some, these typically are on the bay year round. This is the male with the sort of slight knob on the top of its head here. Feed mainly around the south end of the bay. These yellow stars, it just indicates a little bit where they breed as well, because actually they do come out here. And these two I filmed in the Mosset actually. I crept up alongside the Mosset, just managed to get them before they scuttled off, and Mum escorted them out of the way of this silly man with a camera that was taking pictures of them. They're here year round, but there's quite a big drop late summer, because actually apart from some of the juveniles, all the adults move off to northern Germany to molt, and for that period they're pretty much flightless, I think, until they grow their new feathers, and they molt in these huge gatherings in northern Germany, and I think to some extent in the Firth of Forth, but northern Germany in particular, and then they all start to come back, and they're back up to quite good levels. They're actually up to about this level already, so even more than we had last year. They're up to about the 200 mark.
Do they move to Moulds just because it's warmer in Germany, or why do they go to Germany in particular, to Moulds? Why can they not moult here, if you know what I mean?
Well, I don't know, yeah, I think they do molt a bit in the Firth of Forth, but for some reason, historically, that is where, obviously, it's in their DNA that they have to move away to where these big gatherings are in Heligoland and places where they do all their molting. I'm not sure the reasoning behind it. I know people do study these, and I've submitted data of ours.
So there are lots of them coming from different places?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So our lot will all join lots from all around, and they breed around the coast. They're quite a common bird in the UK, but you know, just for that period of the molt, they all tend to migrate away, and then once they've got their new feathers and their flight, they come back again. And yeah, shovelers, yeah, we didn't see any of them on the bay, but again, these are starting to breed in reasonable numbers on some of the upper reaches, say Inch Marshes. If you go to there, they are starting to have quite a lot of success on the RSPB site up there, but we didn't see any today. These so-called sawbills, because of the shapes of their bills, are two species which are the bane of fishermen around here. I don't know whether anyone is a fisherman, but they're always complaining about these, because these breed on the rivers. So although they come down here at this time of year, they will migrate back up the river Findhorn and fish wherever they can, or nest wherever they can. So there are two types. The one that's around in quite reasonable numbers at the moment are the mergansers, and you'll see them at the northern end of the bay from the War Memorial at the moment. We also have one or two gooseanders around here. So looking at them in slightly more detail, the mergansers, the females of the two species are quite difficult to tell apart, but the the sort of brownish necks, or rather fades into the base on this one, and they've got more or less just a straight bill. The males on the left here, they're quite easy to tell apart because the mergansers are much more colourful. The gooseanders, and this was a pair sitting on the mossed actually, the male on the right, you can see it's just pretty much all white underneath, so slightly bigger as well, and with that down curved tip of the bill. And you can see the differences, that the brown markings on the head are quite sharply defined from the whiter, paler underneath, whereas it doesn't fade like it does in the gooseand and the merganser. And that's the merganser. Catching mainly fish, like flatfish out on the bay, and that's a lot of the birds that you see that do fish on the bay. This seems to be a common species. The flatfish is what they catch. Curlews, we saw some of these. Again, a lot out on the bay at the moment, probably a couple of hundred, maybe 250 or so. Numbers increase in the winter, and they actually breed inland, so the upper reaches of the Findhorn, certainly on the moors up there, they will breed. But they also breed to some extent on lowland areas, like the airfield, on suitable grass on lands on the airfield. There's one in flight. We saw several in flight as we arrived, flying over the top onto the airfield. One which is quite similar, which we've only missed by a few weeks actually, a whimbrel, slightly smaller but a straighter bill. And these come through at certain times of the year. So actually the whimbrel migration in blue, August, in fact we had some into September and early October this year. These were last year's. But the curlew you can see on the green line are here all year round. Numbers drop off obviously in sort of April, May, as they disappear back inland onto the moors on the upper reaches of Findhorn. But some also come from abroad. I had a bird out there a year or so ago, which I could see had a ring on it, and I eventually read it what it was, and because it had letters on a coloured ring, and it took a bit of getting, but I did see it, and it actually came from somewhere around there in Finland. So some of our birds that we see out in the bay are not necessarily our own birds. Some will come from Scandinavia or maybe even further afield for the winter. Lots and lots of these on the bay, oyster catchers. They're here year round, and again in the spring they will move inland to breed on moors and anywhere. Even on if you go into Forres, the A96 roundabout, you get to. There's been a pair nesting in the middle of that roundabout on the A96 for the last couple of years. So yeah, they'll get everywhere. But the bay is an important area, and there are about 1,200 on the bay at the moment. Godwits, there probably were some out there, but I didn't really point them out. We get bar-tailed godwits for almost all winter here, and to some extent we do get these black-tailed godwits, but none just at the moment. Last winter we did have quite a few. They actually come from two different areas in terms of breeding. The black-tailed godwits rather come from Iceland, whereas the bar-tailed godwits that we have are all from sort of northern Scandinavia. And the bar-tails generally at the more northern end of the bay, up and down that channel. There probably were some, there are about 70 on the bay at the moment. The black-tailed godwits are often down here, but there aren't particularly any at the moment. But the bar-tails, you can see, other than a gap in the middle of the summer, they're here most of the time. Numbers go up and down a bit, but we typically have 60 or 70, which we've got at the moment. Black-tailed godwits come through largely in spring and autumn, and then carry on further south to overwinter further south in the UK. But as I say, although we had quite a lot last year, the blue line here, we don't at the moment. Redshank, lots of these on the bay. A few do breed here, but at the moment, sort of 400 or 500 on the bay, the vast majority of which have migrated here for the winter. So whilst we do get one or two breeding on these salt marshes, they also breed down in this area here. Most of them have come in from Iceland, Norway, Scandinavia, and their numbers up at sort of 600 or 700 usually most of the winter, and then we're left with just a handful over the summer months that are breeding here. Didn't really see, I did see a few, but they were rather distant, but there have been quite big groups recently. and they're often sort of gathering. They look quite grey at this time of year. Like quite a lot of waders, they change plumage and they get much more red in them, and they're actually known their full name is red knot, but in winter they're just fairly grey birds. Again, these come in from a wide range of areas, but quite a lot are actually Iceland. I haven't marked it on the map, but also Greenland, and the numbers can be pretty high, up to sort of, so they're 1,500 or so at the moment, so quite well above, and these are 2 years worth. So you can see they don't, because they move around the coast quite a bit, they don't always have a constant number on the bay here. But you can see one arrow going north up there that way, and that's actually was a bird roughly where we were standing this morning. Some guys from Highland Ringing Group came down, put some mist nets out to catch these dunlin, these knot at high tide, and they caught this one, and you can see it actually had rings on it already, and it turned out that was ringed in Arctic Canada. So some of these birds potentially have come all the way across the Atlantic and overwintering here. So they come from a wide range of areas. Obviously Arctic Canada at this time of year gets far too cold for most birds to exist. Alongside the knot, which is that one, we've got lots of dunlin on the bay at the moment, and again there were some feeding by the channels out beyond the geese this morning. Smaller, look a bit browner at this time of year, but if you get closer you see them just sort of scrabbling around on the bay, just finding little sort of bits and pieces of worms and goodness knows what to eat, crustaceans and stuff. But if a peregrine comes up, these, like the knot, sort of gather themselves in big groups and a huge great sort of murmuration across the sky. Don't worry too much about the names, actually. There are various races of dunlin and they breed all the way around the northern hemisphere. Most of our local ones are these so-called Shintsii, which are they do differ a bit between them, but basically they're all dunlin. And they arrive here after breeding in big numbers in September, and we'll have them typically 1,000, 1,500 all winter. A few ring plovers, I didn't see any this morning, but there are probably a few around on the bay. Again, you may see up to about 20 over the winter months, maybe on the beach, on the back shore here. If you're walking along there, you may occasionally put up a group that's in the sort of Findhorn Dunes area. That's where I quite often see them. But they do breed here as well. This was taken on Findhorn Beach a couple of years ago, and a little sort of juvenile. That actually was a bird that had bred on the point, on the E, the mouth of the bay, on shingle, and they won't have any nest as such. It'll just be a group of stones that they'll lay their eggs in the middle of, and they're really well camouflaged. It's very, very difficult to see. And this year we actually, for those of you who are around in the summer, you probably saw that fence line around there. There was an attempt to try and sort of give them a bit of protection, and I think it succeeded to some extent, but I did see some juveniles later on, so I suspect they probably did breed there, but I didn't actually detect whereabouts. And again, there are big migrations that come through here in sort of September, but also late spring as well, and most of these are heading way back north into areas, but there are a few that are here all year round and do breed on some of them. And they breed down in the dunes as well. I've come across nests down there. And they used to, 30 years ago, they used to breed in this area here, but there's now so many people that it's too much disturbance and then they're no longer breeding there. Golden plovers, we saw a whole lot flying over the top of us, and they then landed on the bay. And this is another species that comes down here over winter, but comes from higher up, the upper reaches of the Findhorn on the moors up there. Almost certainly there will be breeding golden plovers on the moors there. So widespread across the northern moors, but there are also types of golden plover that actually come in from the north as well. So we have our own birds that come down here for the winter months, up to sort of 150 or so like we saw today. And they will gradually disappear inland to breed, and they'll go back quite early in about March time. They'll all pretty much be gone. And then we suddenly get another spike of birds, and these are slightly different race of golden, but they're still golden plovers. But these are the birds that are going right back to these Arctic regions, And their breeding grounds obviously are not available to them as early as our local birds, so they tend to be later getting back to their breeding grounds. Turnstones, a few of them along the shoreline at the moment, picking over crabs. Obviously, this was taken down by the piers a couple of years back. When they come back initially, they've got quite a bit of sort of brown on their tops, and that's their summer plumage, and they change from season to season. And that's then in flight. And you'll see them flying along in front of the village sometimes. Again, these are migratory, don't breed here, so no turnstones present over the summer months, but up to around about 30 odd over the winter here. Finally, just get on to one species that's not here, and I know someone asked me about ospreys over when we were out in the bay. They're here from about the beginning of April, sometimes at the end of March, through to the end of September. And I saw the last one or two on the bay in October, but by now they've all gone. But they're a typical summer sight, hovering over the bay, plunging in to take out fish, usually a sort of flat fish like this, and I think that was a flat fish rather than a salmon, but salmon are usually, a big salmon will be too big, but they will take trout as well. But there was one day when I was standing not far from where we were today, and I saw this one, and I noticed it had an aerial on the back, and basically what they fit to these bigger birds increasingly these days to monitor migrations are these satellite receivers and GPS trackers. And so this had satellite telemetry, and it's actually got a little solar panel to charge a battery, which will last then about a year and a half. And I sent this to a local expert, you may have heard of, Roy Dennis, who I know, and he sent me back, that was the details of where that bird was when I was seeing it. And he could get this telemetry downlinked via satellite, and later that morning he told me, and these were sort of, 2-minute intervals, and I was somewhere down here, I was just watching it, and it took this fish, and then I think it flew off into Coolbin Forest. But as well as doing it on a local basis, it also gives complete migration routes that these birds take, and the yellow and red are the summer and winter, sort of the north and south migration routes. So they don't all follow the coastlines, a lot do. Some will occasionally get blown offshore, so they do manage to regain their track. But a lot will stop go overland, stopping at lakes in the middle of Spain and so on. And then a lot of them, you can see, just make a beeline across the Sahara rather than coming down the coast. And actually there's a good reason for that, because they know watering holes, oases across the Sahara. They'll land in these and then wait till about 11 o'clock in the morning when it's getting really hot and you've got really good thermals, and they'll then soar up to about 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet above the desert and then just glide for about 30 miles or 30 kilometres or so, pick up another thermal, and they'll do this, and it's far more efficient than just constantly flying all the way down the coast. And that's why, that's how they use or migrate. So that's a bit of an insight. A bird that definitely doesn't go to the upper reaches of the Findhorns. Goes much further afield.
Normally to fly from sort of here down to Western Africa.
Well, birds often, when they're flying north to get back to their breeding sites, will go much quicker. Going south, they may well stop off. And some actually now stop off the whole winter in southern Spain, Portugal and so on. But a lot will have places that they may stop off on the way. They may go, these may have stopped in Poole or somewhere like that, or Christchurch, and around those sort of areas, Chichester Harbour, where they also nest now. But others will stop off then at various places. And I've seen them on the estuaries in southern Morocco as well, stop there for a while as well. But they eventually go right down to West Africa, where they spend the whole winter. But they can fly quite long distances, but they will typically put breaks in on the way down.
What do they find to eat down in the desert?
Well, they will stop at watering holes and oases which may have fish in them. So, and there will be, and I've seen them inland in Morocco as well, quite a long way inland in the edge of the desert there, where there are big lakes, and they'll simply stay there and fish and then feed themselves up, and then they'll go on the next leg. But there will be stopover points. But in some cases, they may just go long distances without. And this one, for instance, they had a long leg across here because you got blown off course. And again, coming all the way across the Bay of Biscay. It may have stopped in Brittany, but may have gone straight on to sort of south of England. So, yeah, sometimes they will fly quite long distances if they have to, but typically they will choose places to land where there's fishing available. Right, and that's all. So that was a short-eared owl in the sun. That was like, I don't know whether you got to it, but that was taken out in the bay. Otter. And I was watching fishing for ages. It just wasn't bothered by us at all. And eventually, after it caught about 5 or 6 fish, it just hauled itself out on a log in the sun near where we were standing. Just didn't seem to be bothered. Right? Yeah, questions, Joe?
Is it possible to look at Dunman and tell whether it's one of the different subspecies or whatever?
Yeah, I didn't bother to get into them. They are Dunman's quite a big variety, but some of them species have longer bills. Some, when you see them in their summer plumage, have more red on their backs. But really, because there's some overlap and we get them coming in from all directions, it's difficult to tell. To be absolutely certain, you probably have to go to the breeding grounds and say, yeah, these are alpinas, these are Shintzii, or these are Arctic. But yeah, you can tell that there are species we see on the bay, because clearly a lot of these do come down. They're not just local Shintzii birds. We do get some of these more northern breeding species with us on the bay. And sometimes in late spring, you know, the ones that are breeding locally have already dispersed back inland, and you're just left with some of the ones which are waiting before they migrate back to their breeding grounds, because the chances are they may still be covered in snow if they go back too early, and then they've got nothing to feed on, so it becomes a bit of a disaster for them. Yeah.
So, Richard, really interesting to see all the data. You know, it sounds like you do quite a lot of collecting that yourself. Do you feed it into somewhere?
Yeah, I haven't really talked, but there's a local bird recorder, a guy called Martin Cook, and all the sightings I get, I feed into him. That data then gets processed, and we draw up an annual bird report for the birds that are in Moray and Nairn. So, you know, you can say when birds were breeding, where they were breeding, when the winter peaks were, and, you know, birds that you see over the summer months too. But there's also organised counts on the bay on behalf of the British Trust for Ornithology called the Wetland Bird Survey, and this happens once a month through all year round actually, but we only do counts over the winter months for about 5 different months, and that then gets all sent directly into the BTO to build up a picture nationwide, and all these counts happen on the same day, a Sunday, once a month. And so I help out and do much of the Findhorn count. So we have to then go out like we did this morning, but count every single bird that there is on the bay, which is quite, if you're racing against the tide, it can be really hard work. Yeah, and if the weather's foul as well, you're trying to do it on that day. So yeah, the information does get fed back into the system to some extent.
Are those graphs or anything like that data available online anywhere?
No, not really. It's just ones that I've drawn up. I just have Excel worksheets or numbers actually, because I use Apple. But yeah, you can just draw graphs from, and I take weekly figures throughout, and I've got 10 years worth of data of all the birds on the bay, of what number, the maximum numbers of any species I see any 1 week. So I try and do that well. Yeah, there's some weeks when I'm away, but there may be colleagues who've gone out and done something. Yeah.
So those composite graphs for 10 years, or is that like
no,
just the
that
last
was
year?
2022's numbers that we got. Yeah, no, not composite.
No.
These were just the weekly totals I established in last year. Yeah.
You can look at the summaries on the website, or they've got a database that you can look, and you could look at Richard's patch, if you like, or at least a group of patches in Murray,
Okay.
and see what the numbers are.
And which website again? This is the.
It's a Murray. I don't
yeah,
know. I
yes.
may have. I can't remember whether I've got. I may have actually just. Bear with me a second. I'll just get out of it.
I was planning on sending an email around to you guys at the end, just to give the Murray Bird Club another plug as well. There's lots of passionate folks such as Richard with lots of knowledge that are really forthcoming with that knowledge as well, and very welcoming to new members. And I can include the links like this
Yeah,
as well.
this is the website. If you just type into Google or whatever search engine you use, birds in Moray Nairn, drop down menus, and under bird recording there's a recent sightings or recent records, and then that just goes through, and this was from a few years back actually, back in 2013 or 2015 or something. But yeah, so that just gives a daily sort of record of what there is. But there are other things like under bird reports, if you want to look in more depth what the last year's report, I think it goes back a few years now. I think it's 2019. We're about to do the next 2 years coming up, but that'll give a breakdown for the whole of Moray and Nairn of the sort of numbers of all species we have. Breeding numbers, where they're breeding, and there are quite a lot of graphs in that, and tables of birds, and quite a lot of these waders obviously feature in that, the ones from Findhorn Bay. So yeah, that's.
What do they all eat? I feel so ignorant. But, are they all eating fish?
No, not at all. Yeah, the bay, you probably saw lots of worm casts, or you might have seen worm casts out there. So there's lots of things living in the water, in the sands, and they often come to the surface where there's water. So a lot of the smaller waders will be feeding on these, the various worms and crustaceans.
What about geese? What do they
The
eat?
geese won't be feeding on anything on the bay until spring, when they get onto that picture you saw of the two close up. We're on the salt marsh down at the southern end of the bay, and in spring when the grass is growing, it's fairly rich and nutrients for them, so they'll feed up on that before migrating back. But at this time of year, the geese are just purely roosting on the bay for security, if you like, against predators. They will then fly off, like we saw this morning, to go out onto stubble fields, if there's any sort of grain left, or more probably onto sort of grass fields to actually just feed on grass, basically. And that's what they'll feed on all day. And obviously the farmers get a bit irritated because that's their crops for sort of silage and sheep and cows and stuff like that. Or worse still, it's actually cereal crops that they've planted early and they're all getting nibbled out. So yeah, but foxes and otters, like we saw, are obviously an issue, but particularly foxes inland, so they won't want to stay on a field overnight. They'll come back to the bay where they can gather in big groups like we saw this morning, and it's just added security. But if a fox did come out in the bay, which they do sometimes, I do see fox, they'll get a goose will almost certainly see it, and they'll alert everything else. So the foxes will probably stand not much chance, and likewise otters. They will be on the bay, and they will feed certainly on carcasses if they find any. Right.
I'm just wondering, there's a flock of pink-footed geese down Montrose then as well.
Yeah.
So how do they decide? Is it the same birds coming?
Yeah, the birds, and you saw in that graph there was really big numbers, 40, 50,000 maybe on Findhorn Bay for a while. But a lot will then, and it may just be tradition, that is where they've always gone. Birds are often, when you start seeing ringed birds, you often start seeing them in the same places. So they migrate as families. So, if the offspring have always gone down to Montrose Basin, they will then go down with their offspring, and so it'll go on. So yeah, they will initially come in from the north, stop off here to feed up before migrating on further south to Montrose, but they go much further down as well, down to the Wash, and huge numbers down off East Anglia and so on as well. So a lot of these estuaries have big populations, but it's just where they've gone in the past, where they've found places to feed. Right.
I'm not sure this is a question or not, but I'm fascinated by the feeding techniques of some of these waders. Some seem to sort of stamp on the ground.
Yeah.
Others just waggle their beaks about.
Yeah.
Others are quite targeted themselves.
Yeah, they do. The ring plovers, you will often see just standing stock still, and they're probably listening for something, and then they'll run. Whereas the dunlin will just go around pecking bits and pieces out, so will the knot. Other things like curlew and oyster catchers with longer bills, they'll be out on the sands because they can penetrate deeper with their bills, so they'll be feeding from there's worms and stuff that are underneath. So yeah, it does vary, but by stamping on the sands, that often brings things to the surface. So you see it with lots of birds, actually gulls and various sort of waders as well, but particularly sort of gulls and anything with sort of, they'll tap the ground to try and get various bits and pieces from underneath to come to the surface, which they can feed on. So yeah, there are lots of sort of feeding things. Yeah.
And Richard, are they aggressive to one another, the different species, or do they all run?
No, as you saw this morning, generally speaking, not. Other than the only exception is if predators like sparrowhawks come in, or peregrine falcons. I saw a peregrine falcon yesterday, but didn't see one this morning. But yeah, that will then straight away put all the birds up. They get very defensive against them. The crows often harry other birds for food and so on, so they will sometimes cause a bit of sort of tension. But and the gulls, you will often see chasing. It's something, you know, even if it's another gull finds a nice morsel, you'll get chased by other gulls and to try and force them to drop their catch so they can eat them, and that's just their sort of way of feeding. So yeah, but generally speaking, most birds will sort of, they'll just mix out on the bay. But sometimes if all the geese suddenly get airborne at once, that'll often cause a ripple effect. You'll see all the pintails suddenly getting airborne, but then they'll realise there's nothing wrong and all come back down where they've just landed or just taken off.
I'm curious about the oyster catchers on the
roundabout.
The roundabout. Do you know if they bred successfully there?
They've certainly bred successfully because I've seen juveniles. Yeah. I didn't see juveniles this year, but I did see them on a nest this year.
Yeah.
But I know they bred there last year because I remember seeing juveniles. In the middle of the roundabout. Yeah. I guess they just think, well, there are not many foxes. It's a nice safe area.
Deal with the cars.
They've got to sort of negotiate with their young across the other side of the A96. Yeah. So anyway,
What about the seals? Do they don't eat little birds, do they?
No, seals. Seals are purely, they fish out at sea, either with fish or octopus and other things, and some of them go well out into the Murray Firth because there's a lot of fishing for sort of octopus and stuff like that. That all gets exported, you know, these and shellfish and so on. But they do eat fish and they do haul themselves out at the mouth of the bay, and you do see them coming into the bay a bit as well. And the fishermen again, it's another thing that annoys fishermen, because they used to, when they netted salmon here, you were legally allowed to actually kill seals that were interfering with your nets. But you've got to now have a license of Nature Scott to cull seals, and they're not giving any licenses at the moment. So the fishermen on the River Findhorn, they're not unduly popular, shall we say. And sometimes there are 600 or 700 seals, mainly grey seals, but some common or harbour seals as well.
How far down do they come? The seals?
Well, they come, I've seen them right on the bay, right down to sort of Bin's Nest. They're really only in the tidal area. They don't go up the river at all. They'll come into the bay as the tide floods in. But most of them stay off shore. You're probably not talking a great number in the bay, but there will be some, certainly, and they're obviously feeding, finding things to feed on. But most of them are hauling themselves out at the mouth of the Findhorn and have probably been feeding right out in the Murray Firth somewhere, Burgate Bay. Right.
Brilliant.
Probably occupied enough of your time.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you.